my name is David Cohen. I own a law firm that specializes in helping dentists and specialists from a legal transactional business perspective. And what that means is I do a lot of practice transition work. I help draft and review contracts in connection with practice sales and purchases and partnerships. I also work a lot on business formations, business structuring, real estate in terms of buying and selling real estate, and review of leases. Those are the main things that my practice specializes in. The experiences have been great. Andy's a really hard worker. He's incredibly expeditious. He's on the ball, and he really does everything he can for the client, but he also understands the full transaction and the scope of it, and that it has to work for everybody. And he does his best to make sure that it does work for everybody. And I think in the end that provides a really successful transaction that closes and optimizes the opportunity for it to close. I think there are two primary pieces of advice that I would have for that particular individual. Number one is make sure that they're ready to sell. I've dealt with some sellers in the past that think they may be ready to sell and they're not, and it ends up being time consuming for all parties involved. And there's time, money, and headaches for that particular doctor as well. And they get to the finish line and realize it's just not for them. Now, sometimes it just takes getting to the finish line for them to realize that, and there's no way around it. So I'm not knocking them, but if they can do the best they possibly can to begin with to, really do some soul searching and make sure that they're ready to sell, I think that's extremely important before they start paying legal fees and, spending their own time, money, and also other people's time and money. The second piece of advice that I would have is to hire a good team around you. It's really important to know that you can't do everything yourself. You specialize in dentistry, and even if you specialize in other areas, you probably don't have the requisite time to do everything properly. It's really important to have a team that's dental specific, in my opinion, and really lean on them to help you. A team could consist of people like DDSmatch and Andy, or a lawyer or a CPA, insurance agent. If they're on the buying side, they need insurance, they need to get credentialed, or a bank if they're buying. I think the one thing that people need to understand when they're going into a transaction is that, particularly in the dental world, is that a transaction has to work for everybody in order to be successful. And if either side comes into the deal wanting to scrap for every inch for themselves and not understand that there's another party involved, it can make for a very difficult transaction, and it can actually cause tension between the parties to the extent that, like, if you're a buyer and you're being a pain, the seller may not want to have the incentive they don't have the incentive to help transfer that goodwill after the closing, to the best of their ability. Of course, they have to for the contract, but you want, as a buyer, the seller to go out of their way, even above and beyond, to help you transfer the goodwill in the practice and have a smooth transition. So, and on the seller side, you want to make sure that the buyer's comfortable and that the buyer's feels good about the deal. Even if the seller is motivated and has the itch to go do all the things a broker would do, they probably don't have the time. I would be certain they probably don't have the expertise, but even let's just say they did. Let's say they've been a broker in the past before they owned a dental practice. They probably don't have the time to do it properly. And when you're selling a practice and you're going to take in a lot of money, it's important to do everything properly. And so it's really important to retain a broker in the transaction if you're selling, because they are going to work really hard for you to, number one, locate a buyer, and not just locate any buyer, but locate the right buyer for your practice, which is something DDSmatch does very well. And they're also going to help facilitate the transaction. There are a lot of things that go into a transaction that doctors don't realize. Many people think sometimes that brokers just sort of sit on the sideline, put the parties together, and wait for the deal to happen, and that's all they do. And that's not the case. Brokers work really hard to make sure that every part of the transaction is covered, and that they're also bridging the gap between any type of negotiations between the parties. Sometimes if attorneys are butting heads or something like that, the broker can step in and do a really good job to facilitate the deal, to bridge any gaps and make sure that it goes as smoothly as it possibly can. We've already talked on this conversation about why it's important to keep things very smooth in a transaction, because there's so much at stake and there's so many emotions that either one, you don't close the deal if you're not able to bridge those gaps, or two, you close the deal, but then you have problems afterward. And as we know, nobody wants problems after the fact either. Yeah, I would say that if someone came to me and said, hey, thinking about selling to the DDSmatch, should I do that? I would say, yeah, they're an awesome company. They have really hardworking brokers, and most of the work that I've done with DDSmatch has been with Andy Edmister, and so that's the person that I would talk about the most. But I'm sure the same goes for their other brokers. You want somebody who's going to work really hard to not only get you a buyer, but get you the right buyer, and who cares about that, and who cares about the deal, and they care about all the components that we've talked about on this interview, such as making it a good win-win for all parties involved. Even though the brokers represent the seller in the deal and they do so zealously, it's important that the buyer feels good about the deal too. Because again, you don't want problems that could derail the deal, and you don't want problems after the deal. So they do a really good job at making sure that it's a win-win, that everybody is happy, and that it's fair and reasonable for everybody. And again, they work really hard. So certainly I would advocate their services.